Welcome back to another episode. I am here today with Joe DeLoss. Joe is the founder of Hot Chicken Takeover, which he sold in 2021. Joe, thanks for being here today, man. How you doing?
Really well. Thanks for having me, brother.
Absolutely, absolutely. And before we move on to the big and beautiful life that Joe has now, and for those watching on YouTube, that beautiful backdrop is another story in itself. But Joe, I want to kind of start back to Hot Chicken Takeover, and I just admire your story for a handful of different reasons. But one thing I was thinking about was what a huge risk you took, as we all do, starting companies and as going down the entrepreneurial path. But you entered a space that was had a high risk of failure in the restaurant industry. And one and two, I was thinking, wow, he dove right into chicken, which is so competitive. And I don't have to name all the competitors out there. We all know who the big boys are, but you, I think you kind of stayed out of the more of the fast food and kind of the quick serve space. But Joe, how did you take that leap of faith and say, yeah, I know it's high risk, but I'm gonna leap into the end to the restaurant industry and pick chicken of all things.
Um, yeah, great, hell of a question to kick it off with. I think all those things you said are true. I think the other side of that same coin is that the industry itself is highly competitive and has a high fail rate because the barriers to entry are so low in food service generally, especially the approach we had, which was very much, I think, maybe a couple years ahead of pop up as a business strategy. And so I chose it because I thought it was the easiest way to prove out my thesis, and a thesis that I'd failed at proving probably three or four times prior in other business enterprises I had attempted to launch. And my thesis was there was just a better way to do employment, and a better way to do workforce development, and a better way to do justice reform, and all of these other places. And so what started for me is kind of a vision. I think when I would have been 20, 21, was that, I had these two things that I loved, and it was entrepreneurship and community impact. And I had spent a lot of time volunteering in my life, but not a lot of time feeling like um, that volunteerism or kind of more charitable philanthropic mindset would ever be sustainable. And so I had a great mentor in my life that told me there's this thing called social entrepreneurship, and it's the intersection of kind of sustainably trying to tackle community adversity through earning money in an aligned way. And so what went from there was kind of a failed career as an investment bank analyst, to gain some competencies, to just myriad startup attempts, some with a little success, mostly with a lot of opportunity to learn and grow. And Hot Chicken came on the heels of I was out doing consulting in the nonprofit community, working with some great partners, but just generally wasn't into what I was doing, and had just failed at building a staffing company that operated ultimately under the same operating system that Hot Chicken did. And we were out selling services to logistics providers and distribution centers in Central Ohio that that didn't want to hire people with criminal records, or what we called alternative resumes at that point, because they thought if we hire people with records, our theft will increase. And we said you're hiring the folks without records now because they're really effective at stealing and they haven't been caught. And so we flipped. That script flip didn't really function well out there in the community at that point, and just knew we had to validate that labor strategy ourselves. And Hot Chicken Takeover actually was just kind of the product and the idea that I thought, relatively agnostically, yeah, we'll give it a shot. And so when we had the idea after a trip to Nashville, we were expecting our first daughter. My wife was about 7 months pregnant, and I Googled on the way home how to fry chicken. We bought a cheap fryer from Bed Bath and Beyond, and just started kind of iterating and testing, all with the idea of we wanted to build kind of a diverse, inclusive workforce. We wanted to treat people with equity and dignity. And if we believed that if we did that and treated our team as the primary stakeholder, it would pour over to our guests and our customers. And ultimately, that is what played out over a huge arc of trials and tribulations and building a brand, ultimately to move towards an acquisition and exit about 8 years after that, after I Googled fried chicken.
That's incredible. So the chicken part, the main part of the business was actually the byproduct. So we talk about culture a lot on this podcast. And so from hearing you, it was more about building your culture and hiring a diverse, audience of resumes and coming together with second chance opportunities for human beings to come together and treat with respect. And so can you elaborate on that a little bit, Joe? What was that like in
Mm-hmm.
the beginning stages of growing the company, and where were you finding your future
Mm-hmm.
employees? And were they even surprised to say, oh, this is really cool, I've been turned down so many times, but this guy's giving me a second chance?
Yeah, I mean, I had been in that kind of workforce development, impact oriented space, both on the for profit nonprofit side for probably 10 years prior to Hot Chicken. And so most of my best teachers were people that had experiences that were really different than me in life. And so I had a moderate amount of relationships with folks that had alternative resumes, that were looking for kind of bigger and better opportunities to grow the stability for themselves and their families. And so when we started it, it was just calling my friends that were seeking opportunities still and growing. And so as the business grew and our need for employees grew, it became about building dedicated relationships with community partners that were engaged in that work, had a pipeline of candidates. I think there was so much novelty about who Hot Chicken Takeover hired, that often the story of how we hired and how we engaged and supported people and what we expected of people to be successful on our team, that kind of latter story always got kind of subordinated because of the novelty of this restaurant chain that was growing and depending on such an alternative labor pool. Now, fast forward, the economic conditions and the macro environment and a broad employment crisis, particularly over entry level kind of labor industries, has made the nature of the work we did at Hot Chicken Takeover, at this point 10 years ago, as we were starting and kind of, pounding that drum, is a lot less novel, thankfully. And what we saw as we grew, particularly through COVID, was that our team's engagement in us was just a representation of our engagement in our team and the nature of the operating system we built as an employer. And so it was a lot more about how we hired, how we supported people, the nature of benefits we provided people. And so I think ultimately, for joining an industry as kind of a reluctant restaurateur, um, our pursuit of growth and scaling impact was really driven by the desire to create more high growth career opportunities for people on our team because they were loyal and committed to our brand. Um, and the only way you build those, additional manager jobs, additional salaries, additional 401ks, all those things, is by opening more restaurants and building a corporate team. And so I really found myself chasing that vision of growth because it was the opportunity to expand our impact. And some in hindsight, I've learned a lot of lessons about that. We learned a lot through the acquisition, um, and so yeah, it was a great ride and really validated that these ideas of kind of like decency, respect, dignity, the things that people often take for granted, are actually the basis of the basis of change in a community, and all too often charity and uh, on the other side, really predatory employment practices just strip that from people, and it's no wonder we're not seeing dramatic change in the community on that end, as well as in the community of employers that are um, behaving in a pretty aggressive way towards their target
Sure.
candidate pools.
Right. Joe, you mentioned pop up earlier, and I know that was a big part of your startup days. Of take me through before the first brick and mortar. What did the pop up lifestyle look like for you guys? And during those days, how many employees did you have, and what was the outlook?
Yeah. Well, my wife and I were really big fans of UFC back in the day. And we had a whole group of friends. This was all kind of pre kids that we would go out to BW3s or some sports bar to watch a fight, and would spend the night, eating chicken wings and imbibing. And so when we had this idea for Hot Chicken Takeover, we just started buying the pay-per-views at our our place down on the south side. And I would just stand in the kitchen, had this kind of like open kitchen into a living room where the TV was, and we would I just feed people chicken all night long and test different things. And so the first pop up was very much our living room. And because as an entrepreneur, I had gotten some press kind of before that, the vision for that happened. Um, I would occasionally post. Started building the brand for Hot Chicken Takeover. I would post things on Facebook, and then I started meeting strangers in parking lots and just bringing them chicken. And I remember this guy named Kyle and his wife Angie, now wife Angie, um, met me. They had two giant dogs in the car because they thought I might be trying to assault them or something. And they met me in this random parking lot near our house in Marion Village, and I just like handed them a whole bunch of tubs of, chicken. And he like forced me a $20 bill, and I was like, "Oh man, this has felt really good. I just got paid for this."
Yeah.
And so then we ended up finding this kind of underutilized kitchen on the Near East Side in Old Town, that was actually a kitchen that was attached to a USDA meat packing plant. And I struck a deal with the owner to rent the kitchen by the hour. And we found ourselves, we opened it up, and one day a week started selling chicken. I was still had a full-time consulting gig. My wife was working to provide our kind of healthcare and benefits, and provide stability for us as we started our family. I started digging out the credit card promotional offers, so I could just write myself checks to start investing in things. I got some great mentors that were willing to throw me some cash to test some things out. And that was April of 2014, and by December of that year, we moved into the North Market downtown, and started growing from there. But even then, I don't know if people remember, but the North Market restaurant was only open 3 days a week to start.
Yeah.
And as our team built capacity, and so that was probably a team of like 20 of us, just super scrappy. And as we hired employees and felt like they were ready, we would just add a day a week at a time, and we would sell until the chicken ran out. I mean, we had no idea what in the hell we were doing, and just had a really committed group of people that leaned in and supported us, and yeah, fostered a really beautiful vision for what a company could be, and yeah, the start of a wild ride.
Mm, gosh, I love it. I could listen to stories like this all day. It's so inspiring. Joe, one of the difficult stages, I know I talked to a lot of entrepreneurs, and this is kind of where you just left off, is that part where, there's lightning in a bottle here. Something is working, and I think I know what it is, and I think I know what it's going to take to make it even bigger or to grow this thing. But there's that fine line of like, I'm still the guy. Yeah, I've got 20 people, but I'm still the guy that has to oversee all these operations. But I'm also the visionary. And it's that toggling back and forth of like being present every day and running the company, but also, well, I think we could have 3 locations in this amount of time if we would if I could just focus on this. And did you go through that tough stage? And was that the time where you promoted maybe like a middle management person, or how was that, where it's like, okay, this is working, but gosh, I got to get it to the next level? And what was that sense of vision like?
Yeah. I mean, like an absolute dumpster fire, mostly. And I think, that arc for us, as, keep in mind, I was attempting to be an entrepreneur for, probably at least that 10 years prior professionally. And into my adolescence, I was starting ideas in companies too. And so, I think the other, aside from the isolation of leadership, being under resourced and from a team perspective and from a capital perspective and all those things, I was also kind of going through my kind of personal gauntlet and dark night of the soul as well.
Hmm.
Having, receiving a huge amount of attention, being on the top of the game from an achievement and press perspective, all those things that you are easy to kind of project your value on.
Hmm.
And alongside of that, I was really, really operating in a way that was completely narcissistic and self-serving, and just trying to survive. And and so alongside of all of that growth, also had the isolation of being misaligned with my new family, constantly trying to seek validation from investors externally as I was asking for capital to grow. And so I think aside from like all those functional things you mentioned that are hard problems for entrepreneurs to solve, I was also at probably the worst stage of my adult life to date, and was both experiencing a lot of pain and discomfort and generating a lot of pain and discomfort as my cup poured over. And so that experiencing that kind of crisis alongside of such a bigger opportunity in the form, from a growth perspective, really set the stage for that kind of whole era of my life and my family's life. And so, thankfully, there was a maturation that happened in our business of being able to hire a couple of those key leaders, relying on great operating systems, for strategic planning. And we had a great fractional CFO and all those types of things of where you start to figure out you can find other grown-ups that can help you through those things. That made a huge difference.
Sure.
I mean, I think also foreshadows some of what I've been doing now over the last few years. Um, but yeah, it was a hell of a gauntlet, and finding similarly kind of spiritual mentors and companions to help me personally kind of walk through that isolation and learn what I needed to learn. And of course, that journey continues.
Hmm.
But those kind of years for Hot Chicken, that like 2017 to 2019, where we were on that meteoric rise, we were raising a ton of capital to grow. That was the backdrop for me personally and professionally.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize the loneliness, the island that you're sitting on in those early days as an entrepreneur, and I don't know that that feeling ever goes away, right? Like you experience quote unquote success by society's term as you're going through the business successes, but there's always a reason of like, well, I don't really know that anyone can quite understand what I'm going through right now. And I've had
Yeah.
so many beautiful conversations like that with entrepreneurs over the years, and I think people are willing to talk about it more now. But it was, you said isolation a couple of times, and it's it's definitely, not all roses, and the saying is
Yeah.
it's lonely at the top. But thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I know that's a lot of awareness, by the way, for you to say narcissistic, tendencies, and to realize, I mean, you did receive a ton of media for how you were running your company, right? And
Hmm.
in a positive way. Everything we mentioned to begin this conversation, what an awesome way it was to hire, and the way you chose to run it and make chicken the byproduct of the why, the bigger reason.
Hmm.
And so thank you for sharing that. And as we progress, the hot chicken story goes on. And 2021, you decide to exit. Was that something from day one? I think I'll sell this someday. Was it? as life
Mm.
progressed and business progressed and an offer came in, it seems like a good idea. Kind of take me through uh, the the process
Yeah.
of it makes sense to walk away.
Yeah. Well, first I'll just say yes, yes, awareness, awareness that was brought by a ton of teachers, awareness that was brought by a clinical diagnosis too, and so all those things are really critical. And I wouldn't have. I It's a privilege to be kind of in that isolated state as an entrepreneur,
Sure.
and of course because it affords you all these other things and all these other opportunities. But yeah, it's absolutely isolating, and as you've kind of expressed on your podcast multiple times, that's why we end up finding people like ourselves to sometimes commiserate and other times support. And the sense of understanding you have when you can look at somebody else in the eyes that's been through it or might be in it, um, it's such a gift to be able to express that to each other. Of just
Yeah.
remembering that this season, this too shall pass.
Sure.
um,
Find your tribe.
and
Yeah.
you're probably just preparing yourself for the next shit show. But it's great to build your capacity to serve that way. And so I mean, I think as an entrepreneur I always desired to build something that I could sell. um, and of course there are like functional reasons why that's really beautiful. And uh, but it's also, always seeing myself as somebody that just loved the art of business. I was so desperately seeking my opportunity to gain the credibility to get to play the game of business and express that art and creativity like on a bigger scale at the level I really loved, which is to be in communion with founders and to support people through that isolation, um, and to not necessarily have to be the technician. Anybody that was on my team would always express how reluctant of a technician I was, and it's not that I didn't fry my share of chicken or do my share of dishes. It was part of our culture. But I mostly just wanted to be in deep relationship with people. And as the business grew, um, my distance from those core relationships that, those 20 people that I started with in the North Market, um, as the business grows, your capacity to be in relationship changes a lot. And so increasingly, as the company grew, it was almost more so of a liability for me to be in deep relationship with the team member because there are two or three managers between that person and me. And so if I'm the one holding the trust in the relationship, I'm constantly put in this position where
Yeah.
culturally, people, there's fears of favoritism. There's I'm stepping over the jobs other people are meant to do. And so I really wanted to protect all of my managers' like opportunity to grow and to lead. And so I started to feel more and more distance from from the nature of relationship that I loved. And I started to see what the future was going to look like, which is we're going to keep stamping out these restaurants, we're going to grow markets, we're going to expand. And the problems I started to solve were a lot less about relationship, and they were a lot more about my capacity to understand a contract, or to pick the right real estate, and things that I was never passionate about solving and having competency in. And I did it because it afforded me the privilege to be in relationship with the people I was interested in being in relationship with. But functionally, the job I was doing was becoming less and less, kind of, it was filling my cup less and less.
Yeah.
um, and and so we were not seeking an acquisition. We were raising capital, and we had an inquiry from a company that ultimately turned into an acquisition opportunity. And we did a huge amount of diligence, and we spent a ton of time and energy. And it felt like one of the best opportunities to grow opportunities for our team and these people I cared about, and to find myself a pathway that felt more comfortable to me just as an individual, not just as a representative of an idea and a company. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what you want to talk about in terms of that acquisition. I'm happy to share whatever I can. And yeah, I gained a ton of perspective. And hindsight's always 2020, but I learned a lot of lessons through that, and hopefully wisdom that will be able to apply to other things.
Sure. Well, no, thank you for the lead up to that because I think that's what a lot of people don't realize either is outside looking in and Joe's growing this company and it's people first and he's all over the media and it's such a cool story and it's growing and he exits. End of story. Right. Well, there's just so much more to it. And it's your why, right? Like there is that sense of hurting of like, well, as this thing grows, which it's supposed to do to benefit everyone, it's also depleting me, is what I'm hearing you say. And you said your cup was becoming less full. And I don't think that probably gets enough respect for your story. And anyone that's been down that road is it's so cliche to say, well, it's not just about the money, but really when you're talking about your livelihood and your why and you're young enough to go keep doing other things, like I have a ton of respect for that. And one of my next questions was, and I think I already know the answer to it, but was there that post exit hangover? Like, oh, maybe I should have held on. We
Yeah.
could have done a few more things. Did you have any of that seller's regret?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the hardest part for me as a contributor to that specific brand is think about the inflection point I kind of started with to just share the backdrop for a lot of my personal growth and familial growth and all those other things that happen alongside our business expanding. The role that I played in that company, that made it kind of, that put me out in front, that made me the storyteller and the brand builder. Again, huge gift to do all those things. But as I kind of recognized that my cup would not be filled through the achievement of this thing, but it would be based in the relationships I had with my daughters, with my wife, with all of these other kind of, with my family, with healing a lot of the pain and discomfort I created along that path, my cup started filling up through a variety of other things. And I was, in many ways, kind of playing a bit of a character of the person I was that built that brand, because that was the role, that was part of my job. And so I would show up as I could, to represent that brand in a thoughtful way. Um, and and so I think, really probably like 2019, which is pre-COVID, I started to feel like a lot more relief in the purpose and the contribution that my life was meant to have, and was thankful to have that job and that opportunity at Hot Chicken Takeover. But I knew that that was, though many people perceived it as a full extension of my soul, I started to recognize there was so much to, my role in the world. And felt really thankful, for that level of awareness. And so I think the hangover that happens for many founders, is because they haven't had the space to have that experience, and have that processing and that healing before that exit happens. And so, I had a relatively peaceful experience in transitioning. Not that it wasn't wrought with things to show up for and energy to deploy, but thankfully I did not. I did not experience the crash that many of my friends have in those moments, and that kind of crisis of identity of, if without this thing, who am I?
Right.
And it was like, well, this thing actually came to be because I figured out who I was in a lot of other ways. And I'm still on that adventure. I'm going to be on that adventure for the rest of my life to explore that. But my season with that chapter was done, and I was engaged to stay on board, much longer than I ultimately did stay, because I also started to feel the misalignment of, um, oh, I had 8 years prior to this moment to make every decision that is now on the table and being made. and I can't thoughtfully represent these decisions because they aren't decisions I made. And um, we really focused hard to protect who we hired going into that transaction, all of which was like well documented and and kind of like legally bound as part of that agreement. But in hindsight, we didn't thoughtfully protect well enough how we hired people and how we supported people. And as the business started making changes that ultimately affected that culture,
Hmm.
um, uh, I felt more and more distance from that, and didn't feel comfortable expressing, my kind of work energy in that capacity. And so that ultimately led to my a larger separation where I went off on my own without much of a plan for what was next. But thankfully had the privilege of some downtime and space. And so, yeah, thankfully not as much of a hangover as many have experienced. But yeah, I feel really grateful for all the teachers and the support I received up to that point, so that I could have a more peaceful experience and show up for people where they needed me.
Yeah, it sounds like you had about a 2-year window there, 2019 you referenced, to almost kind of set yourself up and re-identify
Hmm.
of who I am in comparison to what I've built. And once it's, the ink's dry in the next couple of days and people are wiping the sleepies out of their eyes, I think that's when maybe the depression kicks in, or wait, what's next? Who am I? The identity crisis. But it it's awesome to hear that you kind of saw that a couple years in advance and were able to take care of Joe first, really, right? Because that's ultimately what his family needed, and everything that you're working on now, which I think is a good segue into, Joe, if anyone's ever seen interviews with you on podcasts or any other media outlets, and you've said it already in this podcast right now so beautifully, is you're a purpose first kind of guy, and the purpose of why, and that journey, as you just mentioned, never ends. So now that it's been a little time, take me through. I know there's the farm life now, and the city life is no longer. What's Joe's purpose these days? What's waking up every day look like now that you have that in the rear view and the most beautiful experiences that go with it? But purpose looks a lot different now, and kind of take me through what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple buckets I could share. Yeah, I think I mean, I spent a lot of my life being in service to myself, um, and all of the consequences that come with that. And so in that kind of latter stage of my experience at Hot Chicken Takeover, where I definitely saw my purpose to be um, in service to others, and the richness of that community and what it can. I mean, it got us through a global pandemic in an industry that was really hard hit, um, in a really strong way relative to what many others were experiencing, thankfully. And so at some point early in 2021, um, my kind of family unit made a choice. We had started homeschooling through COVID-19, and we made a choice that this vision we had for maybe uh, some land to go visit on the weekends. We started to imagine, like, what would it look like if we just lived out of the city, and I could commute in for work. And that all culminated, and we ended up finding a home and a property up in Knox County, um, that, closest to kind of Gambier and Mount Vernon. And we really fell in love with this place, and we bought a home. And kind of very naively, I was pushing my $200 lawn boy from Lowe's into a property with like maybe 6 acres of mowable grass. And so we learned a lot of lessons. And it was as we started to settle into that new rhythm for our kind of family unit, um, about a month after that move, we got the inquiry that ultimately led to the acquisition of Hot Chicken Takeover. And so we kind of made this choice. And then life started to open up and conspire in pretty unique ways that we were listening to. And so I'm a steward of a lot of land at this moment that I'm learning how to work with, and just kind of filling my cup with a lot of time in the dirt. And building that kind of manual wisdom and capacity has been really lovely for me. And so we got a lot of projects here, and we're happy with that. And then the kind of like professional expression, which really just started picking up here in the last 12 months, um, is a few fold. One is that I'm finding my way as kind of an advisor and partner to other founders. And so sometimes that is in kind of like an equity investment capacity or an advisory board capacity. But I've been able to build a handful of really lovely relationships with other people that have been in that moment of isolation, pinched between a team full of people looking to them for strategic direction and stability, and a whole bunch of investors looking for God knows what they're looking for. And so I found a lot of purpose in being in relationship with those people, and hopefully trying to knock off the edge of some of that isolation. And so that's kind of one camp. A second camp that I'm really passionate about is that we've taken the operating system we built at Hot Chicken Takeover, and a few former colleagues and I are building that into an operating system that we can deploy in other businesses, particularly those that rely on shift labor. And so that business is called HRT Systems, Heart Systems, and we're building kind of an operating model that in a really tactical way can build rich cultures and organizations. And so right now that's predominantly professional service work, and I've got great partners that are out contributing to other folks and other industries, and I get to kind of strategically direct and creatively direct, and jump in as a coach when needed. um, so I love that, and I think is going to take on a life of its own really quickly, which I'm excited about. And then probably the thing where I'm investing most of my kind of technician energy that I have, the little I have, is as a guide for outdoor adventures for men, and which is kind of a weird departure from a lot of what I've done. But I've been taking people out on trips since I was 17 and kind of coordinating adventure, and really believe that, man, just the wildness and kind of uncertainty of what nature can provide is so rich and such a great teacher. And I think it is a great level set for kind of conventional masculine energy in some ways. And so I have a bit of this bait and switch, which is I'm like crafting adventures and inviting people out. And it appeals to a level of like endurance and physical expression and fitness and all those things, and then becomes such a unique backdrop for men specifically that are at inflection points in their life and are looking for change. And so yeah, I mean, it's kind of high level review, but so I just this year officially kind of launched that as an initiative and a company, and have a crew of people that are lining up to support me, which is really awesome. And yeah, we're going out on adventure.
What are these retreats called, Joe?
Uh, Geez, I guess I mean I'm kind of treating it in a cohort model. I don't know exactly what I'm calling them. I'm not trying to, I think the uncertainty and wildness of it all is what's so critical. And
Sure.
so, though I am a guide and kind of steward for these experiences, um, I am trying to kind of allow them to define themselves a little bit. And so, in a very unbranded way, we're calling these trips by exactly what they are, which is like a cohort, a men's spring cohort or a leaders cohort.
Sure.
And so the two kind of camps for those, one is just general like inclusive men's retreats. And so I've taken people as young as 13 and as old as 59 out on trips with a crew of kind of alumni of these adventures. We will work together for 5 to 6 months in each cohort, longer for kind of leadership product. But we'll work together for 5 to 6 months to physically and kind of spiritually prepare for the adventure and the rite of passage we're going to have together.
Hmm.
And then at some point that culminates in a backpacking trip, kind of a 4-day experience where we're putting down a ton of miles, and we're experiencing a lot of like we're kind of holding the space for these men to share wisdom with one another and learn from each other, and we get to expose ourselves to kind of the whatever Mother Nature has in mind for us. And so we try to pick seasons that are particularly wet or particularly hot or particularly cold, to ensure that we're out past a physical edge that creates some discomfort. And I think what's beautiful about what kind of the power of nature can do is it knocks off when you're up against those elements. It knocks off some of that capacity you have, particularly in um, a more egoic kind of masculine energy, to put up these walls and self-preserve and try to project a certain one identity or another. And so Mother Nature just wipes that right out pretty
Yeah.
easily with some physical adversity and inclement weather. And so, yeah, we do that. I've got we just launched some dates for next year for a spring men's cohort that still has is probably by the time you'll air this, it's probably got 5 or 6 spots left on it.
Okay. Is
Um,
there a website then? Is it open to the public?
yeah, yeah. So that bakerroad.com is
Okay.
where people can find information about that. And last year, I think we took out about 30 people. This year, we've got programming that will get that number to 50 people. Next year, hopefully, we'll cross that 75 threshold. And then the thing I'm really excited to test out for those of us that have been in peer groups of any kind before, we're launching kind of a leadership cohort that'll go January to December, um, culminating in kind of a beautiful adventure that follows these same principles. But then through that kind of cohort experience, we'll expose our group to a lot of different personal development modalities, and so that's something new. I hope it goes well, and I've got a lot of people that are excited for that, and we'll be kind of filling out that cohort between now and the end of 2024, and we'll see what 2025 brings to all those participants.
I love how the story with you is it's just full of pushing to the edges and growth, but there's one common denominator, and that's community. And I'm hearing from the beginning of this with how you built your company through the challenges through it to growth to today. It's finding your tribe and that community of people, and even though we I think all need that time alone, it does help combat the isolation of be it business or personal battles that we all go through.
Hmm.
So thank you for doing this work.
It, yeah, yeah. I think, I mean, increasingly I kind of see purpose is like, how do we keep building our capacity to serve?
Hmm.
Um, and the world is really weird right now.
Yeah.
There is, without taking a too mystical spiritual approach to it, I just acknowledge there's a lot of volatility that we're all experiencing, from economic volatility, geopolitical volatility to there's just like a lot of crisis. And I think particularly for those of us that intend to have a sphere of influence and to build things and to grow things, um, the world has harder and harder teachers in store for us. And so, how do we approach readying ourselves as best as we can for what's unknown, and to maintain peace and compassion and heart when shit gets really weird. And so I think through like my own fitness and sport and trips, I keep trying to increase my capacity to serve, and it gets to be a really beautiful journey because it's fun to explore and adventure and to increase capacity. But I'm also knowing that there's a whole bunch of unknown ahead, and the better I can ready myself for that, whatever that might be, um, the better off I will be, my family will be, and my community, my neighbors. And so um, I think that's a meaningful charge, and I'd want to encourage as many people to follow that same path, because I think the world needs it, and I want to show up when I'm called, and in the meantime, I'll keep preparing myself for those calls.
Yeah. It's all about the preparation, not the outcome, right? You know,
Yeah, yeah,
several months ago, I had my friend Danny Dunsmore on here, and he was I asked him, about work life balance, and it's kind of a lot of the similar things you're saying today. And his response was, "It's all one thing, right? So if we can live in our purpose of, well, wellness intertwines with the work I do, but also intertwines with my family, which intertwines with my spiritual journey, which intertwines with
yeah. Hmm.
leadership. And if it's all one thing, and I've thought about this, kind of echoed in my mind since he said that, and I think it's a beautiful way of it doesn't have to be or, it can be and. We can do all these things
Mm,
and thrive in this area and thrive in this area. Not to say that we're pushing the limits for burnout, but we're welcoming everyone at the table of intertwining all these different awesome, roads we get to go down in life at the same time. So
yeah, yeah. There's this fine line of being in service and preparing yourself for service, and having an identity of having to be the person that does the work. And so I
yeah,
think what I was able to liberate myself from, and will continue to learn lessons and liberate myself hopefully more, is that I want to be significantly insignificant. I want to feel a sense of purpose, because it's how I want to show up into the world, but to not identify and attach to that um, in a way that just uh, sends me back to kind of an old path of achievement and orientation and acknowledgement, attention.
yeah,
Those are drugs that haven't served me well, and I want to stay really aware and cognizant of that. And so I think similarly, I want to encourage people to build their capacity to serve, to have a personal conviction to be of service, but to not have an identity that generates harm because of it, because of your level of self-importance or others. And so, being out now, living in a more rural setting, we have a lot of wildlife, and we see a lot of things. And one of the animals that I feel like I've increasingly learned from, as I just have observed, are turkey vultures, which are, man, like just, something, one of the ugliest birds most people perceive, um, that are out here. Turkey vultures have been designed and engineered to process waste that humans can't tolerate, and that much of the environment and the ecosystem can't tolerate. And they've got stomachs that can handle toxicity in such remarkable ways. They've allowed their bodies to deteriorate so that they can better serve. Um, and they generally do this with the only exchange of being people squirming when they drive past them or see them in the air. And they treat death with a level of reverence and compassion, and they're out serving without condition. And so increasingly, I just want to find myself to become more and more of a vulture, as I grow and learn. Um, and I'm far from perfect in my journey to heal, and to heal others that I've harmed will probably last for the rest of my life. Um, but in the meantime, I'm just going to keep readying myself to be as the best kind of vulture I can be. You know.
yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. Joe, I have two final questions for you today. When you think back of your journey through Hot Chicken Takeover and this personal awareness and the journey that came along with it to put you here today, what's one thing that you've learned about yourself as you've gone down this process, gone down this road?
Man, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about myself. And I think, increasingly probably the most important thing is to forgive and to have compassion for myself. Um, and I think um, that continues to be something hard for me to do. And but I'm grateful that I've learned those lessons. I've had some great teachers and models. I have a wife that um, just has a pretty unbelievable capacity to learn and grow, and I'm constantly inspired and by her path and the work she does. And so to have compassion and love for myself alongside of adversity and has been probably the most pivotal part of my experience. And so I'm really thankful for that.
Thank you. Joe, last question for you. What advice would you give to someone who hears the whisper of a daydream that just seems too crazy to chase?
Hmm. I mean, I think like Chernard from Patagonia said, um, I think sometimes dreams get so wrapped up in having to stay dreams and to be so that people steal from the present with these just aspirations from the future time and time again. And so I think what a better approach is, if you're hearing that whisper, just listen and dip one foot into the water. And if it feels good, step the other and go a little deeper. And so I think for me, I'm trying to continue to prepare myself and train myself to be a good listener um, in those moments. And so much of life and so much is what has been celebrated about life, especially celebrated about entrepreneurship, is your capacity to persevere through opposition, to just muscle and grind and push. And I think the alternative to that is like to listen to that opposition and to see what there is to learn. Why is there opposition? Will muscling through this thing actually achieve what you need, or will it just generate more harm and pain that you got to heal after the fact? And so I think of not recognizing that a dream is something that has to be out into the future, but that dream might just be that whisper that's asking you to just kind of like step into the water a little bit, see if it's comfortable. And and so I think to stay really aware of that opposition, that identity you can create in that opposition that most people will romanticize and celebrate about you. Um, doesn't have to be the way. Um, and so, yeah, I'd love for more people to recognize those moments and those whispers that are happening right now in the present, and just to engage with them and to see what might open up for them.
Mm. Joe, thank you so much for being here with me today. And I look forward to following you in these couple of new exciting journeys filled with massive amounts of purpose. And yeah, thanks so much for being here today, man.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.